Hello, and welcome everyone. My name is Nadia Ali. I'm the director of the Center for Middle East Studies here at Brown University. And it's my great pleasure to introduce to you Professor Asef Bayat. Hello, Asef.
Hi.
Nice to see you today, at least virtually, and very excited to be listening to today's lecture on the global Middle East into the 21st century. Today's event is made possible through funding from the Peter Green Gift for Lectures on the Modern Middle East. Let me just say a few words about Professor Bayat. He is the professor of sociology and the Catherine and Bruce Bastian Professor of Global and Transnational Studies at the University of Illinois, Urbana-Champaign. And before joining the University of Illinois, he taught at the American University in Cairo, and this is where we met many years ago. He served as the director as well of the International Institute for the Study of Islam in the Modern World, holding the chair of society and culture at the Modern Middle East at Leiden University in the Netherlands. His research areas range from social movements and social change to religion and public life, urban space and politics, and the contemporary Middle East. His recent books include Being Young and Muslim, Cultural Politics in the Global South and North, which he edited with Linda Herrera, Post-Islamism, The Changing Phases of Political Islam, Life as Politics, How Ordinary People Change the Middle East, Revolution Without Revolutionaries, Making Sense of the Arab Spring, and The Global Middle East into the 21st Century, which he also edited with Linda Herrera, and his talk today will be based on that volume. I also see that he authored Revolutionary Life Every Day of the Arab Spring. Welcome, Asef. It's wonderful to have you here. And yes, I mentioned, so I've known Professor Bayat for many years when I was actually a student at the American University in Cairo. So welcome.
Thank you so much, Nadia. I really appreciate for including me in your wonderful program. And yes, I've known you for many years. And yeah, you were a student and you're a professor at Brown University, which is fantastic to see you in that position. Okay, so I want to perhaps start, with this talk with the question of how useful sort of the notion of the global Middle East really is. That is, the emphasis on globality of the Middle East is in our scholarship. And why is it important? So to investigate and highlight kind of the global transnational dimensions of what has come to shape our region today. First, I'd like to suggest that a global Middle East is likely to correct some of the misconceptions about the societies and cultures of the region. I think it can give us useful tools to construct more sort of nuanced historical narratives. Secondly, I think it can offer a valuable epistemological sort of opportunity to ask interesting questions and conduct more innovative studies about the Middle East. And thirdly, such approach can potentially contribute to better understanding of the complexity of the very notion of globalization per se. Now, just a few words on misconceptions. I think it's probably well known for your audience that despite much debate and a lot of criticisms by the post-Orientalist scholarship, misconception and misrepresentation of the Middle East in the news media, in cinema, in TV, literature, and foreign policy circles in particular in the West remain really quite relentless. Here, the Middle East is viewed largely from an exceptionalist lens. And this exceptionalism depicts peoples and societies of the region as being, fairly stagnant, entrapped by their own history, culture, and religion, and one that is prone to tribalism and nativism. And in this view, in particular, religion and culture is kind of intertwined, and none of them really change that much. And especially the contemporary conflicts are often attributed to religion, and especially the sectarian rivalries that often we might see, these days are attributed to going back, centuries back in history. Further, the region is usually seen as kind of undifferentiated entity, as if that there weren't there were little sort of variations in culture, religions, religious practices, mode of development, and basically in historical experiences. It is often seen as closed, parochial, self-contained, with little for the Middle East to offer to the world, and one that is responsible for its own sort of troubles. Such a Middle East, then, such a depiction of the Middle East, then it stands, of course, in opposite direction, opposite kind of side to the West. So there is a binary opposition between the West and the East, or Middle East, and which, as we know, has informed the infamous idea of the clash of civilization, which in turn, this thesis in turn has, of course, informed and influenced popular perceptions on media, and especially policy centers in the United States about Islam and the Muslim Middle East. So even though these assumptions have been, as I said, critiqued by scholars like Edward Said and others in terms of Orientalism, I think they still continue really to persist. You might have seen this video recently on the issue of refugees from Ukraine to Europe. There's a comparison between, Ukraine refugees and people from the Middle East, and the journalists basically say that Europeans accept Ukrainians because, by and large, he said that they are civilized, as opposed to Iraqis and Afghanis and so on. So the perceptions, therefore, do still continue. This kind of, as I said, exceptionalist perceptions persist. Now, I think that the global perspective could question at least some of these assumptions about the Middle East. I mean, it is, I think, very useful for in our research, in our narratives, in our analysis to deploy it. But then this globality, this notion of global, is pretty complex and involves different layers, different scales and directions. And it takes different expressions. And for instance, it may be expressed in terms of effect, that is how certain events or interests from outside of a region or of a particular country may affect a particular society or history. And of course, it could be the other way around too. Whatever happens many things that might happen in the region might affect the processes outside. So the second, it could be in terms of circulation, how persons, products, or cultural registers circulate and travel through national or geographical boundaries, which then may be taken on and shared by others, for instance, food. Yeah. Third, it may take the form of exchange, that is, when interlinkages are displayed in the way societies trade, give, take, and exchange cultural and material goods. Of course, this is not a conscious or planned exchange, but happens basically, like literary production or cinema and so on. And finally, it could be in the sense of shared belongings, that is, in the way persons, ideas, or emotions express belonging to not one, but many geographies, when they take the world as home, or the so-called worlding. Now we can see, I think, all of these expressions of globality with respect to the reality of the Middle East, and each in their own way, I think, defy certain Orientalist assumptions. Now let me elaborate on these. For instance, on the issue of geographical effects, the fact is that many things that are attributed to be in the history or culture of the Middle East, like, for instance, or authoritarian rule, may not be necessarily rooted in culture, but be the effects of geographies or certain economic interests. Famously, oil and democracy has been really debated and discussed. We know that the discovery of oil and its global trade really profoundly altered the region. It caused significant economic development in the region, no doubt, as in Iran, in Arab Gulf states. And of course, it brought massive international migration, as in Persian Gulf states. But the interest in oil also invited Western political meddlings in the region. On the example of Iranian, the coup d'etat of 1953 in Iran is very famous. That basically happened as a result of the nationalization of the oil industry in 1953 by, or earlier, by democratically elected secular Mossadegh, and the response was basically staging a coup and removing him, and after which we had a horrible dictatorship until the Iranian Revolution ended, and we know what happened later. We also recently, in more recent years, have seen Western countries invade Kuwait and Iraq, in which oil matters in these operations, and have Western countries have continued to support many dictators in the region, as in Saudi Arabia, UAE, Oman, Bahrain. Again, oil plays very, and geopolitical issues also play a very significant part. Interestingly, Western countries, of course, pay for the oil that they buy, but actually to try to get the money that they pay back by, as Tim Mitchell argues in this book, they try to get the money back by encouraging the sale of armaments, guns and tanks and airplanes and so forth, which obviously creates a supply of arms and facilitate, the conflicts and wars in the region. Yeah. So in a sense, wars in the region are not necessarily effects of ethnic or religious differences, nor the autocratic rule in being an attribute of authoritarian culture, but partly encouraged and facilitated by some of the processes that happens outside of the region, like this massive supply of, for instance, armament to the region. And within, again, this realm, the impact of colonialism is, again, debated, discussed, how, for instance, played a very important role in terms of sectarianization and, especially in Levant, in Beirut, and similar places. Okay, what about circulation and flow? Now, if global forces and processes like colonialism, oil markets, or arms sales have deeply influenced the political and economies of individual countries in the Middle East, ideas and cultural products from the region have also shaped the social and cultural landscapes outside of the region. Just take the idea of religious monotheism. The three traditions, Judaism, Christianity, and Islam, that are rooted in the Middle East have no doubt have altered the course of world history. Or take the arts and culture that for centuries influences from Roman, Byzantine, Persian, or successive sort of Muslim empires have left really enduring footprints in the realms of food, language, arts, and societies. Today, we know a lot of names of food items that in the West, around the world, basically, that have really their origin in the region, like rice, like sugar, sukar, aubergine, badingan, alcohol, Arabic world, kohol, and many others that our colleague and friend Sami Zubaydah has shown very nicely. Or take the films and film industry, that while the United States and the UK film cultures have certainly informed sort of the broad frames of cinema in the Middle East, then we've seen at the same time that Egyptian films and especially TV serials have really enjoyed large audiences, both in the Arab world and outside. The same is true with Turkish, films among Arabs and West Africans. More recently, we have more sort of global audience for kind of avant-garde movies from Iran, from Egypt, from Lebanon, from Kiarostami, Youssef Shaheen, or Nadine Labak, and others. In other words, the Middle Eastern cinema today seems to be kind of showing a globality of multi-directional flows that tries to modify the prevailing pattern of center-periphery flows. Now, speaking of global flows, today and since really colonialism, the diffusion of knowledge has usually taken a one-way path from the West to the rest. But things seem to be pretty different before. They seem to be a great deal of give and take, for example, of knowledge, of science and ideas before the advent of the nation states. In the book, the historian Robert Morrison actually shows how new knowledge and scientific discoveries that occurred at the time within a multilingual and trans-regional scientific culture continued, in fact, through 19th century encounter with the modern science. And another expression of it is the famous sort of translation movement between Greek and Arabic, and then Arabic to other languages. In other words, these societies were not that stagnant or isolated as it might be, claimed these days. Of course, ideas, cultural registers, or food circulate through different geographical territories. They often change and become indigenized. In other words, they become part of a shared culture. So in a way, it becomes perhaps irrelevant to claim or disclaim, such cultural registers. So for us to consider how cricket has become Indian and Pakistani and West Indies as much as it is perhaps English. I think in a somewhat different way, it may be difficult to claim influential personalities or poets like Rumi. Where did he belong? I mean, there's, of course, such questions are asked. As such, he seemed not to have a country, or rather many countries. Afghanistan, Iran, Syria, and Turkey. He knew all of these languages and traversed and navigated all of these cultures. But such a question might not have been relevant before the time of the nation state, because Rumi was a multilingual, multi-local, multicultural personality whose poetry traveled and connected those cultures and societies. These are the kind of a discussion that Fatemeh Keshavarz shows. Now, this relationship between the world and home, or world as home, is, I think, a crucial moment in the concept of the global. Now, one contemporary expression of this worlding relates to the lives of immigrants and diaspora, the exiled, especially the refugees. And incidentally, Middle East has experienced, as we know, in recent years, a massive flow of refugees, especially, since the last decade, after the Arab uprisings, both within the region and their spread in other countries, in particular in European countries. Now, the pain and profit of seeking refuge and being in exile is a familiar enough sort of story to elaborate here. But I think the very fact of seeking refuge in some place and moving and living there objectively can create conditions for a cosmopolitan life, something I personally cherish. And here, I'm not simply speaking of the privileged sort of expats with worldly lifestyles and abilities. I'm speaking of the ordinary sort of diasporic population. First, within the Middle East, the immigrant communities, for instance, in recent years, have considerably extended cultural diversity. This is a direction against the more, shall we say, longer process of, I would say, the process of homogenization, because a number of ethnic minorities and religious minority have left the Middle East. And the story goes back to from even 60s onward and later. But this new sort of immigrant communities is kind of working against that trend. For instance, a lot of Syrians being in Cairo, in Egypt, I'm told, actually I experienced it, that is changing sort of the restaurant culture in that country, and generating sort of new immigrant culture in Egypt. Second, as immigrants have actually moved into Europe, sort of diasporic Islam, and most of them are, of course, Muslims, has become a part of Europe. And it is partly, this that has made scholars like Jürgen Habermas to speak of post-secular society, that Europe for him is a post-secular society in the sense that as a sort of secular place, secular region, it is recognizing the presence and significance of religion in their society. Thirdly, the impact of these diasporic groups on the culture and politics of the home countries, not host, the home countries, original countries, in the Middle East is very significant. I mean, I can think of a lot of Iranians who are abroad, whether it's in Los Angeles or in US or in Europe. I think they are impacting the politics inside the country. Or now Egyptian diaspora in Europe is likely to play an important part in the politics inside Egypt. And of course, these processes become much more prominent during the revolutionary times. Just imagine Ayatollah Khomeini was in exile, right, in Iraq and then in France. Or Rashid al-Ghanouchi, right, was in London before actually he moved back to Tunisia just after the revolution there. But long before this wave, of immigration. Persian Gulf states like Qatar, Saudi Arabia, Kuwait, and UAE had received massive number of immigrants. Of course, there were a lot of them were European and the Arabs, of course, from the region, as well as many, and much more, in fact, South Asian countries. So that in the places like Qatar, foreigners now make up 90% of its population, over 90% of its population. And as a whole on the region, over 50% of the population in the Gulf area are so-called foreigners. This is fascinating. I mean, they have actually altered the very national character of these countries. Just imagine an Arab country in which perhaps 90% speak English, right? The language of largely the working class. So in this sense, the city-states like Dubai, one would expect to provide sort of this social condition for cosmopolitanism. In fact, as we know, Dubai juxtaposes individuals and families of diverse national, cultural, and racial belongings who live and work next to one another within a sort of small geographical space. But can we call this cosmopolitanism? I'm not really sure, because in truth, the objective possibility to experience mixing, mingling, and sharing is not the same as really genuine desire to do so. Now, if we consider carefully, cosmopolitan, actually, Dubai, in fact, is no more than a city-state of relatively gated communities marked by sharp communal spatial boundaries that juxtaposes labor camps of South Asian immigrants, and then the segregated milieu of kind of parochial jet setters, or the cosmopolitan ghettos of the Western elite expats, who by and large remain bounded within the physical safety and cultural purity of their own reclusive collectives. So it's not really as such cosmopolitan in this sense. As I said, there is an objective condition for actually being so, but in reality, in terms of willingness and wanting to share and mix and generate kind of hybrid culture as such, may not necessarily be there. So the sort of effects, exchanges, and circulation that so far spoken about should not give the impression that they all happen kind of in a smooth playing field. Because the fact is that the public sphere of modern world is incredibly unequal. The fact is that the influential ideas, goods, and images usually flow from the center of capitalism, the West, to the poorer nations. I mean, some people even have called this cultural imperialism. But still, I think that good ideas and cultural traits, that means the ones that resonate with global humanity, can create countercurrents capable of breaking barriers and shift the direction of history. One example may be the spectacular Arab uprisings and the model of global tahrir that really traveled and inspired millions of people around the world to develop their own sort of Occupy movements in some 500 countries. Tahrir became a global really meme. I think for a moment, this episode altered the dominant sentiment that Arabs did not care about democracy or incapable of democracy, and so on. And in somewhat, I think it changed the image of Arabs, in particular coming from the 9/11 episode. Yeah. So let me now begin to conclude. So this global perspective, so the narrative of transnational effects, exchange, circulation, and transmutation, should question the claims that MENA societies have been self-contained, stagnant, or undifferentiated or homogeneous. And the experiences of colonialism, oil, or arms sales, armed trade, or exchange of ideas, food, films, and migration should question the opposition of the Middle East on the one side and the West on the other side, this image of separate entities. Instead, they should actually highlight the realities of flow and interconnected sort of lives. Beyond this, I also think that the global perspective can give us a valuable epistemological opportunity to ask interesting questions and conduct more innovative studies about the Middle East. I think this approach would especially open our eyes to invisible linkages and relationships when we study the social phenomena like revolutions or democracy. For instance, these days, I think it is impossible to view a revolution like what happened in the Arab world a decade ago as merely national or local happening. It is very much international and indeed intersocial, meaning that it has overt and covert linkages and effects that may in turn reshape certain social entities outside the local or national territories. So Arab revolutions, as much as are the product of indigenous, internal, national processes and effects, are also a product of, for instance, a regional power conflict, regional political conflict, involving, of course, Saudi Arabia, Iran, Russia, Turkey, the United States, Israel, and so on. On the other hand, I think that the idioms of deployed in the Arab revolutions, I think very much the products of the post-Cold War idioms of civil society, of individual rights, of human rights, and so forth. Yeah. And not to mention, of course, somewhat the effect of the particular economic rationale or neoliberalism that were adopted since the late, since the decade 1990s onwards. So the transnational or intersocial effects matter a lot. But we should be careful and precise and not overdo it. We shouldn't impose unnecessary externalities. For instance, some might claim that everything these days is international. Nothing is indigenous or national anymore. This can be debated. What I want to suggest is to treat it as empirical matter, not as theoretical, because it would have really significant implications. I mean, we should avoid necessarily externalizing everything. We in the region certainly have our own tyranny, our own patriarchy, our own corruption. We cannot and should not really attribute everything terrible that happens in the region to foreign factor or to imperialism for that matter. For instance, some of the positions taken on what is happening, for instance, in Afghanistan these days is a kind of clear example of this. Yes, we know, and it has been, I think, quite correctly discussed, what terrible things the United States invasion really left in this country for years. But there is also the real problem of Taliban's totalitarian approach that really crushes the desire for freedom or political accountability that, you know, these segments of the Afghan population really desire. I mean, you can say that, yeah, Taliban itself is a product of, yeah, Russian invasion, American and so forth. But the fact of the matter is that it does exist now, and it holds, you know, such an approach. Well, what are we supposed to do, and what Afghan people are supposed to do? Yeah. So these are all kind of, you know, part of this global dimensions and interlinkages that I've been talking about. Also, I think a global approach can help us to better understand the dynamics of the Middle East stretched out, Middle East or extended Middle East outside the Middle East in Europe, Middle East in Latin America. I mean, these are fascinating. I think, you know, one of the chapters in the book by John Karam about what's happening in the Middle Eastern communities in Latin America is fascinating. So somewhere, on the one hand, they are, you know, part of Latin America, on the other hand, they are part of the Middle East. Or, you know, closer, what happens in the Middle Eastern community today, for instance, in Berlin. Finally, a global perspective compels us to historicize. That is, most of what we have discussed so far pertains to modern times of the nation state, with walls and you know, identitarian ideologies or inside-outside divides. Things might have been different before the nation states, with more translocal interconnectivity, exchange, or sharing. As we know, people and goods traveled, you know, without our current barriers, passport control, and so on and so forth. In other words, things might not necessarily be how they are now, because things were not in the past as they are now. In other words, I'm sort of throwing this hopeful sign that things can be different. It doesn't have to be this way, in the way that we are encountering these divisions and barriers. So just hope that that world someday will be within our reach. And thank you so much for your attention.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Asef. We now have 20 minutes for questions. I see there's already one, but let me just take the opportunity to say a few words and reflect on your talk, also in light of, you know, the kinds of things I've been thinking about, and, you know, in your conclusions when you mentioned Afghanistan and, you know, sort of caution us to not fall into the trap of trying to reduce everything that's happening there to the effects of imperialism without in any way, of course, diminishing the role, particularly in recent years, of the US. I mean, that resonates a lot with, you know, what I've been thinking about in relation to Iraq. You know, that of course, you know, when I, together with Nicola Pratt, when we wrote about the impact of the invasion on the occupation on women and gender relations, of course, we had to stress the impact of the US, but 20 years afterwards, that is just doesn't hold. I mean, yes, of course, we know that sectarianism and authoritarian politics and corrupt politicians are, and also the emergence of ISIS, are linked to those developments, but they cannot be reduced to it. So I very strongly agree with that. And, one of the things that annoy me a lot is that, by inadvertently actually it is a very Orientalist lens to reduce everything to this idea that people are puppets. And, as someone who's interested in gender-based equalities and justice, I mean, I know that, we have to move away from these static ideas of culture, but we have to address local, regional constituencies and including, cultural factors as well. So I really appreciate that. Now, I'm sort of wondering a few points. One, so the global in your conception, I mean, it contains lots of different things. I mean, there is transnationalism, and I've come to transnationalism in the context of transnational migration. But there are lots of other, of course, transnational social spaces, transnational economics, and flow of culture. But that's one aspect. And then there is cosmopolitanism, which historically is often sort of linked with the kind of more, I think, often, at least in the literature, I'm aware of sort of the more elite structures, but you point out, but there are also these other cosmopolitan places, right? Especially thinking about immigrant communities in Europe. And then there's diaspora. And I'm just wondering if you could reflect a little bit on these different concepts. And, I can't help Asef, given my sort of interest in gender, when you say that it's not a level playing field and there are these inequalities, I guess one question I have, I mean, obviously the one obvious and that you mentioned is class, but what about gender? How are these processes gendered, if at all? And then that will take me to the first question of the audience, but maybe you can respond to my questions, comments first.
Yeah, well, thank you so much. Yes, a large number of them, and all of them really important and difficult. And I agree with your agreement with me, definitely. And that also bothers me too. Yeah, it bothers me too a lot, especially when Afghanistan happened. Yeah, and so they are back, Taliban, and a lot of people are fleeing, not necessarily the ones who were, cooperating when the Americans were there and so forth, but others, especially women. So what about them? I mean, it's a legitimate concern that they had, and that has to be addressed. And I don't think it was addressed sufficiently. Yeah, I mean, these various concepts that mentioned, they have their own sort of, it seems to me, literature like cosmopolitanism and transnationalism and so on. But in the context, when one looks at in the context of the Middle East, and I suppose by others in other regions too, there are connections, between all these. I mean, for instance, the relationship between objective possibility of cosmopolitanism and transnational flow is very much expressed, for instance, in the reality of diaspora or immigration that I mentioned. Yeah, and I think conceptually, in terms of the scholarly, these are good instances or places where, in fact, we can conceptually be more clear and discuss the relationship between cosmopolitanism and, say, transnational migration. And I think I want to emphasize that, yes, cosmopolitanism largely has been criticized as an elite thing, but I do want to actually go beyond it. I happen to have written actually a piece on everyday cosmopolitanism of the subaltern, ordinary people living in the neighborhoods with different ethnic or religious belongings, and how they get along. Yeah, and so by this time, cosmopolitanism, by everyday cosmopolitanism, I mean the sort of the process and desire to transcend self, to associate with agonistic others. Yeah, transcend self. That means both personal self, religious self, national self, ethnic self. Yeah, to associate with agonistic others. Yeah, so that this can generate the possibility of sharing, and generating even hybrid cultures. And I was saying this on the basis of somewhat fieldwork I did in Shubra area in Egypt, between Christians and Muslims, who, for instance, families living in apartment buildings, one flat this, one flat that, and how they shared. And women, here comes the role of gender, and the women were the protagonists of this interconnectivity. And the women would actually associate and talk to one another on an everyday basis, borrow things, lend things. Yeah. And this shared thing, as I said, if you look at the decoration of their homes, so they are Christian, Coptics, and Muslim. They're so similar. Yeah. So these are indications of kind of blurred culture, and there are other instances I can mention, but we don't have the time. Yeah, I mean, perhaps in the book we should have be more explicit, about the sort of gender dimensions, but it does really exist in particular. For instance, in the last chapter on whether there is such a thing as cosmopolitanism, the life of Zainab and Habib as a Jewish woman, in Istanbul, and her experience, and what really happened, which really is different from the world of men.
Yeah. Thank you, Asef. If it's okay with you, I'm going to read out two questions.
Sure.
Can you? Yeah. Okay. So the first question is by a friend and colleague. Hello, Nilüfer Purzan. She says, "Thank you. How do you position MENA's gender equality struggles and that of the LGBTQ community and trade unions, etc.?" So that's the first question. And the second question also by a friend and colleague. Hello, Mehmet Kurd. Thank you, Asef, for this wonderful presentation. I'm curious to hear more how post-Islamism operates globally and to what extent the governance of transnational Muslim spaces by Islamist governments of the Middle East and North Africa affect the conditions, politics, and daily lives of global Middle Eastern communities.
Okay, so for the second question, for the second part, I might ask to repeat, but let me get back to that later. Yeah, the feminist, I think, I haven't done personal research on, unfortunately, feminist internationalism or feminist transnational connection. But a student of mine here, actually, she has started doing research on the interconnections between feminists in Iran and Turkey. And in fact, she's asking the question why there isn't, much of a connection, despite the fact that their some of the struggles are similar. And in fact, they can get help from one another. And of course, she's now exploring. I personally do not know the answer. I think there are also practical issues of language. Language, how you connect, in what language you speak. Turkish, Persian, they are different. But in a certain milieu, when there is a language of either common language, not just English, but among the Arabs, for instance, and such things do exist. And I do know that there are connections between especially after the Arab uprisings, between Tunisia and the Egyptian women's activists, and they were exchanging ideas and strategies to fight a kind of backlash that I argue in my most recent book against women's rights. About LGBT community, again, I'm not sure myself. I haven't done research, but again, to the extent I have read sort of the literature, and I have actually talked a little bit in again my latest book, post-revolution connectivity between LGBT community within the Arab world, actually quite considerable. In par with, for instance, atheists. Believe it or not, an atheist movement emerged after the Arab uprising within the region itself, and the variety of sort of platforms emerged and connections were really established. So the new communication technologies actually have helped, but the new communication technologies have also been now under the very significant surveillance on the part of the states that perhaps that might put restraints on it, and the activists should find a different way of communicating.
Yeah. Asef, if you allow me to say something about that, because yes, I think the other side of the coin, though, and that I think is important for your argument as well, is that when you look at the anti-gender and homophobic discourses that are central to right-wing mobilization in Europe, in the US, we actually also have to really start questioning the sort of old categorization in terms of East and West, and also really start to question the idea that there is something inherent in terms of Western society, in terms of their commitment to either, feminism. I mean, we know that for a long time, or to challenge heteronormativity. But I think in this specific political moment, I mean, one thing, we've just actually organized a conference with Humboldt University to look comparatively at Europe and the Middle East. And what is so striking is that the anti-gender discourse and the political homophobia is central everywhere to right-wing mobilization, right? So that there is also that globalization actually going on. I think exactly. That's a really important point in terms of also challenging what you say, this dichotomies, of the Middle East, exceptionalization of the Middle East. And yeah, okay, sorry, I took some time. I will reread.
Okay, good, yes, it's irrelevant.
Yes. So Mehmet's question, I'm curious to hear more how post-Islamism operates globally, and to what extent the governance of transnational Muslim spaces by Islamist governments of the Middle East and North Africa affect the conditions, politics, and daily lives of global Middle Eastern communities.
Okay, yeah, so the global interconnection of the post-Islamists, I think there is such a thing, even though at the beginning they were largely national things, national processes, because post-Islamists largely were responding to the excesses of, or the danger of what they considered the danger of Islamist activities, both as movement and, of course, in some countries like Iran, as a polity, as the government. However, I don't want to make myself central to this, but when I was in Netherlands, actually I brought together researchers who were working on post-Islamism in various Muslim majority countries in a few days conference, and the result of which became the book Post-Islamism. And since then, there has been actually, I understand, connections between various movements that they consider themselves as post-Islamists, even if they might not name it. And there are conferences, there are travels, from one country to another, for instance, in Indonesia, and they know a lot about what is happening in Iran or what is happening in Tunisia in particular, by which I mean an Nahda party. So there is, such a things, but it is not as organized as, shall we say, Muslim Brothers, Muslim Brotherhood as a kind of transnational movement that have very established connections and operations and organization and so on. I couldn't quite understand, the second part, because I'm not sure if Islamist government create transnational space for Muslims. So if I may, I just pass that.
Okay.
Sorry.
Sure. Okay, so then Fulya Pinar, hello Fulya. So she's thanking us, and then I'm wondering if you have observed through your research how the economic dependence on migrant labor in the region have been shaping migrants' organizing powers, potentials, and social movements.
Yeah, this is an excellent question. Again, I personally have not done research on this, but the research done, and in fact includes in the book by Ahmed Kenna, for instance, actually does show that the more recent sort of tendencies on the part of immigrant laborers in the Gulf region try to respond to the terrible exploitation that they feel they are getting from the host countries. But it is very difficult, and as you know, there's a kafala system there, and in fact, organizing on the part of the workers is not really tolerated. But in fact, strikes have happened, in recent years, especially after the recent financial crisis that impacted the Gulf areas as well. How should I say, a powerful, I would say, sort of social movements emerging out of the organization and resistance of migrant laborers has yet to come, not yet.
Mm-hmm. Well, thanks so much. There is another question, and I have lots of questions, but we have run out of time, unfortunately. So I'd like to thank you very much, Asef, and of course, encourage everyone to look at the edited volume, which was, of course, co-edited with Linda Herrera. And I mean, I've had the pleasure of reading it, and it's really, really interesting. And, some of the contributions are amazing. All of the contributions are amazing. So thank you very much, Asef.
Thank you so much, Nadia, and friends who pose questions and discussions. Yes. I appreciate that. Thank you so much.
Yeah, also thanks to the audience, and bye everyone. Hope to see you soon.